All right, good morning, everybody. It's time to get started. Welcome to the October 2nd, 2023 Grants Pass City Council Workshop, and we have some members of the Home Builders Association and our Housing Advisory Committee here with us. First up is a discussion about minimum density. Welcome, Brad.
Thank you.
I feel like we haven't seen you in a while.
It has been a little bit. Good morning. As you said, Mayor, this is one of your every other month joint meetings between Home Builders Association and Housing Advisory Committee and Council. The topic today is minimum residential density, so I was just going to go over, here's kind of the agenda that we're looking at. I'll kind of summarize what the original purpose was of the code, what the actual content is of our current code. We had a couple councilors contact us with requests for information on what the current zoning is and what the current platting activity has been. So we'll go over that, and then the alternatives, a few alternative approaches, and then we're just going to turn it over, have the Home Builders Association get their perspective, and Housing Advisory Committee perspective, and then council dialogue. So since the majority of council was here for most of this minimum density, I won't go into all these details, but just to refresh your mind, it did start in 2019 when the Housing Advisory Committee was discussing minimum density and asked for that to be added as a potential tool. Bottom line, skip to 2022, the council did adopt that April of last year on a 5-3 vote. So some of the origin and purpose, at least, starting with HAC and their conversation, is that why would you do this? Why would you mandate that a owner construct to a minimum density instead of allow what is in the zoning code? A couple of things coming from those early discussions. It does help to accomplish some housing goals that are in the adopted comprehensive plan. It does help to increase the number of houses in areas that are zoned for moderate and high density, and that's an important and where public services and infrastructure have the capacity to serve those. Housing production goals, you recently adopted the housing production strategy. There are a couple of nexus points between that strategy that you adopted and the minimum density code, and then it helps to increase the diversity of housing types. So those were some of the origins and purpose statements. What does it actually say? It applies to the R3 and the R4 zones. I listed the -2 zones up there because as of today, we actually still have the zoning transition overlay, but those -2 zones, assuming that you proceed in a few weeks with that, those would go away. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But it requires basically, if you're in those two zones, R3 or R4, that you have to build to 60% of whatever the maximum density is. It does say that if you have a site that is non-conforming, you can't go further out of conformance, which really just means you can't demolish what's there and put up some kind of, more single-family detached housing. Units can be added. That brings it closer, so that's just saying you could phase a project as long as you demonstrate in your plan that you will be able to get there. All land divisions in the R3 and R4 zones are required to show compliance. So if you come in with a partition or a subdivision and you're in an R3 or R4 zone, you do need to show conceptually how you would be ipable to meet that. And then it does have an exemption in there for all the natural features. So if you're working with property that has floodways, riparian setbacks, etc., those are deducted from the size before you do your calculation. So here's the actual target numbers for the minimum density that were in the code that council adopted last April. So in the red, you can see in the R3, 10.4 is the minimum density that you have to get. That's dwelling units per acre, and then the R3.2, that's 12. Again, that would be is expected to be deleted if you remove the zoning transition overlay. And then in the R4, it's 20.8 dwelling units per acre. So it removed this M feature, which we have had in the city's code for a long time, but there was not any property that actually had M zoning on it. So this amendment last April took that M out and just said, here's what the minimum density is. This is just a reminder, the R3 and the R4 zones, while they're not really a traditional mixed use zone, what a lot of jurisdictions have is a, quote, mixed use where you allow multiple types of land uses. Our R4 kind of serves in that capacity as well as our general commercial. This is some of the other land uses besides residential that you could build in those zones. Professional office, bed and breakfast. Most of our schools, I shouldn't say most, but many of our schools, you know, have our zoning, and then daycares, hair salons, religious assemblies. Those are all allowed. So when you're looking at the numbers in terms of the vacant land or the available land, it is possible that these kinds of uses could go in, and so they wouldn't all build out at residential. We showed this graphic to you when the minimum density came through last year. It just compares two subdivisions that we saw come through, Highland Meadows and Evergreen Manor. Highland Meadows built out with single family, that's 11 lots, and then Evergreen Manor, that's 11 lots as well. Both very, very similar in terms of size, but the Evergreen built duplexes. So as you see on this table, they're both in the exact same zone. They have pretty similar sizes, and the same number of lots, but the number of units built was double in Evergreen Manor. Now that was built before the minimum density went in, but this was shown just to show you if there had been a minimum density, that would have required Highland Meadows to have doubled the units. Here's the distribution of our zoning where the minimum density applies. It's all over the place. North of the river, south of the river. Here's the vacant and under-improved lots. So Councilor DeLaGrange did ask for a clarification on this slide, asking what exactly is the breakdown between vacant versus under-improved. Really what we use is the first column here. It's if the valuation on the lot is $10,000 or less, that's really what we call vacant. Could it have a small building on it? If it had, you know, like an old garage or an old shop or something, and it was, you know, kind of falling apart, I mean, we would still actually consider that vacant under our policies. So really we're talking about 313 lots that would be considered vacant. That's of the 3,400 total. So basically about 9% of them would be considered vacant. Under improved can also include any lot that is a half acre or bigger that has a house on it. So when we're doing estimates of build outs, we will usually look at that as our metric. So we will take, okay, here's the number of lots that are a half acre or bigger, and even if they have a house on it, that wouldn't come up as vacant because it has a house. But we would consider it under improved because often there is additional space that on that lot that could be accommodating new dwelling units. So we got this request on Friday. I was not able to get that specific number in terms of how many of the R3 or R4 lots are fit into that category, but certainly the majority of this 3,400, what we do know is built, and then we have 9% that's vacant, and so somewhere in there you've got that range that would be considered underdeveloped or under improved. This just shows how many of those R3 and R4 lots kind of by zone, how they're broken out. Another question came up, what level of, I think this was Councilor Auger, asked how much platting and building activity has actually happened in the R3 and R4 lots. So we actually went back 5 years, and the year that the platting or activity happened is the last digit on this first column. So you can see we had just one in 2018. We had quite a few in 19. And this year we've just had one. So it shows 14 subdivisions or partitions that are in the R3 or R4 in the last 5. So some of those are built, some of them are under construction, and some of them haven't even started. I think we can carefully say that the Memorial Park Cemetery is kind of an outlier. But everything else you could see some kind of residential use on. The dark green ones are the ones that fall into the zoning transition overlay. That's why they are called out. 4 of those 14 include triplexes or higher in terms of what they would allow. So the Aurelia subdivision, which again is not developed, but was purchased by Jackson County Housing Authority. The Wallace subdivision has triplexes, the home bridging, and then the Peter James middle housing land division. So those are the 4. Everything else other than the cemetery is scheduled or built for single family detached or duplex. This is just kind of showing, we didn't look at them all, but there's really only one, and you can see the Evergreen Manor in the last 5 years that is not the higher than a triplex, which would meet the minimum density. So the Evergreen Manor came in at 69%, so our code requires 60% of the maximum. So Evergreen Manor would have met it. Keegan's Court and Blackberry Glen are just 2 examples that would have fallen underneath what the minimum density code would have required, or does require, if they would have been built during the time that the code was in effect. This is where I wanted to go into a little bit more about the zoning transition overlay. So in July, you tentatively authorized the repeal of that. It's expected to get your final review on October 18th. It's scheduled on your agenda. The Planning Commission last week reviewed the comprehensive plan amendment that accompanies that, so we're waiting for that now. So what would that do, and how does that relate to the minimum density? Well, the zoning transition overlay, there's about 1,100 acres of land in the urban growth boundary that is currently required to meet the minimum density code. 318, or about 28%, is inside the zoning transition overlay. That repeal will revert about 168 acres, 168 of that 318 to lower density zoning or general commercial, which leaves about 150 acres of the current zoning transition that will go to R3 or R4. So I guess the point here is that, you know, there is going to be some of the land that is currently, and that you expected to go to minimum density, that is no longer going to be subject to that code because it will not be R3 or R4. There's about 150 acres of that 318 that will continue to be required to meet the minimum density, but the rest of it, about 168 acres, will not. And then it should be noted this does not equate to 150 acres of vacant or buildable land, because we do have, you know, quite a few acres that are, you know, have wetlands or steep slope or something else that would not allow for that. We're talking about really gross acreage here when we're looking at minimum density. Here is just kind of graphically how this plays out in the last 5 years in terms of building permits. The dark areas is the R3 and R4 zones that are scattered throughout the urban growth boundary. That's kind of that dark gray. The yellow dots is new commercial permits that we've seen, and then the blue dots are new residential permits. So there have been 142 new single-family dwellings. There have been 44 single-family attached, so that would be like a townhome. There's been 52 duplexes, so each of these blue dots, like one blue dot would be a duplex, so there's actually 2 units. So 52 duplexes, so 112 units over the last 5 years in those 2 zones. And then we've had a few other commercial and garage shops, things like that. Here, this isn't all of them, but when we did our research last year, these are some of the main cities that also have minimum density codes. Particularly in the Portland metro, there are a few others. The ones in Southern Oregon, Ashland and Medford. They vary a little bit, but for the most part have a similar approach to what Grants Pass does in terms of, you know, setting a minimum number of units. How they go about that is a little different, but that's really the goal of all these. So leading into our conversation ahead with Home Builders Association and Housing Advisory, these are just a few things to kind of pepper into the conversation. Really based on our observations, you know, we've seen in community development kind of these 2 common responses to the minimum density. One is, you know, some resistance and, well, we're just going to wait it out and see what happens and not build. Another really is that there's not a whole lot of impact because they were going to be doing at least the minimum density anyway. And a good example of that is the affordable housing project that is on Harbeck that's being built right now, the Cathedral Square. You know, that would have been their plan anyway, whether the minimum density code was in effect or not. So some other alternative approaches, some of these we talked about last year when you were going through the process of adopting it. Some of them were new, but you could, by just prohibiting single-family detached housing types in the R3 and the R4, not actually mandating a certain density, but just prohibiting single-family, you in essence increase the density because you have attached or middle housing type units. You could reconsider the 10,000 square foot lot exemption. So this was something that Ashland has, a couple of other jurisdictions have this. So if you have a lot, it's 10,000, it's in the R3, R4, you're exempt, you don't have to comply. Require minimum density only for developments along transit corridors. That's an approach that particularly is, that we see up in the metro area, Eugene. Decrease the minimum density threshold. You know, currently it's at 60%. If you went to 50%, it's an approach. And then creating incentives to achieve maximum density is another approach. And that would obviously be a voluntary versus mandatory tool. So that's what staff has prepared. However you want to handle the next steps, Mayor.
Let's see if we have any questions for you first. Are there any questions for Brad? Valerie?
Yes, can you tell me, since the middle housing code has been initiated, how many duplexes or triplexes have been built on some of those properties? Do we have any record of that?
We do. We have, I think, 5 projects that have been submitted that are underway. I don't have the exact number of units, but that in terms of middle housing, it certainly has gotten some traction. And Justin Gerlitz has worked with several of those and could probably also speak to that. But again, it's not a mandatory tool, it's voluntary, but it has certainly, what we've seen is at least got people thinking creatively about maybe some other ways they can use their property since it is allowed. And that middle housing land division, we should probably honestly come to council with that, because this was something that we under the state statute, we're not required to adopt in our local code. It just kicks in across the state for all medium and large cities. But that's also a pretty, I mean, it almost provides just as much, if not more, incentive, because what it says is if you already have it, like let's say a triplex, and you want to divide that into ownership instead of rental. The Middle Housing Land Division, under the legislation from 2 years ago, says you can come in and you don't have to meet a lot of the traditional requirements that you would have to meet otherwise for a land division. So, for example, frontage, or some other utilities. You can just take that triplex, you can divide it, and then you have ownership opportunity instead of just rental, which if you can't divide it, then you can't sell it. And so it has to be rental. So we'll see. I mean, the jury's still out a little bit on that one because it is fairly new, and we've only seen a couple of applications come through. But that's another piece of the puzzle that we may see that will help to encourage middle housing.
Rick?
Thank you, Brad. Can you go back to slide 6? You indicated on natural features like wetlands and so forth, steep slopes are deducted from the lot size before calculating the density. Does the developer, if they want to go to higher density, can they use that acreage towards their density, or is it not permitted?
Are you
You're saying,
getting at what the gross is? We wouldn't. I mean, I'm trying to think of a situation where they would want to do that.
well,
Generally, but getting to net, it gives them at least achieving the minimum density that's going to work in their favor. Or am I misunderstanding?
true, but if somebody wanted to recognize all the acreage that was there, do they have that opportunity as well?
Yes, under the development code, it doesn't
Penalize them?
penalize.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions right now? Go ahead, Rob.
So on slide 19, the second bullet down, it says prohibit single-family detached housing types in R3 and R4. So currently, you could have a single-family home with some other configuration on that property, right, to meet the density, or no?
Yes, that is correct. You mean if you have a single-family house already today and you want to come in and do a project?
Right, or if it was vacant land, can you put a single-family house and others to meet the density together?
So
Not sure if I
the
understand.
middle housing code that the city has not yet adopted but was proposed actually said no to that question. It did completely remove single-family housing detached as an option. Today, and under the state model code, you could use like a combination.
Right.
You could do like a single family over here, and then you could do like a quad over there.
So what's the thinking on that? Because I don't remember, or if I ever knew, but what's the thinking on why a single family would be prohibited as long as the density for that property is reached? Like why would the city care whether there's a single family house there with some other cluster or quad or whatever?
Well, it would.
You understand
really
what I mean? Why would we care as long as the density is reached, why would we want to control that?
Sure. It's a good point. If the density is achieved, why? And I don't think we is. I mean, middle housing basically does that. It says that you can do whatever mix you want. You know, it doesn't say that there's a minimum density, but today it allows for that. I think the reasoning from other jurisdictions who have done it is that the lot size that's required for a single-family detached house, you know, is, for example, 5,000 square feet in several of our zones. So you have to plat 5,000 square feet. You can't go smaller. You have to meet that minimum size. And so if you do 3 or 4 single family, then you're, you know, 15,000, 20,000 square feet to get the building lots created. So I think the thinking is rather than allowing it at all, then you're essentially, you know, going from that 5,000 down to like a 3,000, which is what the minimum would be for, you know, like a triplex or a quad or something like that. So it really, I think, ties to what the lot size is in the subdivision.
But I guess that, what you just mentioned is really a second discussion. I mean, if a developer can meet the density with it and have a single-family home there, I mean, so in other words, what you just mentioned is a completely different discussion about the minimum square footage for a given single-family home. You know, I don't understand why we would care about that if the density is met and if the square footage is sufficient for a single-family home along with others on that property. Like, why would, it's almost like we're regulating on top of regulating to no end.
Right.
If you understand, I don't know if I've expressed my question accurately, but
I think I understand it. I mean, you know, we're talking policy here, so there's pros and cons to all of it. From an infrastructure and utility standpoint, going back to my earlier point, if you do a 5,000 square foot lot it's intended for a single family house, you know, you're going to stub, you know, typically one sewer, one water, you know, the gas to that lot. And so then you come in later and you want to do a duplex on there. So then you're going to, so in terms of laying out the utilities and the infrastructure at the front end, you get more efficiency if you know at the beginning that single family is just not allowed.
Brian's online today. Go ahead, Brian.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, thank you. I just had a question back on slide 12 regarding, I just wanted to make sure I understood this correctly, the breakdown between the vacant and under improved. You said the vacant of those 2 big red numbers at the bottom right, vacant is about 9% of that total and under improved is 91%. Did I hear that right?
You heard the first one right. For the under improved, I clarified that there's a high percentage of those total lots are already built out with, you know, structures, and so they would not even be considered under improved. So it's not as simple as going 9% for the vacant, which is that far left column, the 313, and then taking the difference because that 3404 number is all lots in the R3 and the R4 zones, meaning vacant, under improved, and built out. So under improved, of a completely built out lot that really doesn't have any setbacks or any opportunity to put any more dwelling units would not be considered under improved. Does that make sense?
So are you saying that the vacant land is higher than 9% or lower than 9%? I'm just trying to figure out how much of this R3 and R4 land is actually vacant.
Right. Well, under our definition, if it has no development, no structures, or under $10,000 in value of structures, then that's vacant, and that is that first column. So that's the 9%, 313 lots.
Okay, great, thank you. And then I just had one more question about, you referenced a little bit after that, the zoning transition overlay repeal. And I didn't get the, so it looks like about half of the acres are going to be repealed from R3 and R4 to a lower level. Is that
Yep,
approximately 150 acres will revert to R3 and R4?
correct.
So will that be increasing our stock of R3 and R4 land?
No, no, it'll decrease from where we're at today. Because where we're at today is 318 acres that are in the zoning transition overlay with the R3 or the R4. So if the zoning transition overlay goes, repeals, you take away all of the -2, so either the R32 or the R42, then some of those are going to go back to an R3 or an R4, but most of them are going back to like an R16 or an R18. Now remember,
So
we do have 12.
revert out R3, R4.
I'm sorry, Counselor, I was.
168 acres that are currently R3 and R4 will be reverting to a lower density or GC zoning?
Right.
Okay. Cool, thank you.
You bet. And just to clarify, we do have 12 property owners that did contact us and said, we actually want to retain the higher density zoning. Excuse me. We are working with them starting later this month to rezone their property because they're going to be going back to the lower density, but we're streamlining that process and giving that grace period to other people that may want to do that. So those 12 property owners will actually increase that number a little bit when we come to later this month and we know exactly how many people are interested in going. But at this point, I guess the point is, overall, yes, the number of R3 and R4 land is dropping with this zoning transition overlay repeal.
Vanessa, did you have a question?
I don't have a question, but I wanted to hopefully provide more clarity, Councilor Pell, to your concern. I am interpreting the prohibition of single-family detached housing on slide 19 as a suggestion in lieu of minimum density ordinance. We see a majority of our R3 and R4 land has been developed with single-family development. So I think that it's just, rather than allowing wide open development, in the event we didn't have minimum density, it would prohibit further single-family development on that high-density land.
Dwayne, did you have something? Then Joel? Is your mic on?
No, I don't think.
Okay, okay. I can hear you because I'm sitting right
I
next to
can't
you.
hear it.
Yeah. Just, and then pull it down, push the light on, and then pull it down towards you.
Doesn't Rich? That's kind of awkward. Yeah. I'll try to talk as much
That is
oddly as
better.
possible
That's better.
until they give me a better mic. But on page 8, it says, that's probably better. Can you hear me? Here.
It'll
Hello?
click on it, so there you go.
That's better than sitting sideways and trying to talk. So on page 8, it talks about R3 and R4 zones, but it says, our goal was to put as much housing as possible, but looking at that page, you can put office buildings, daycares, churches and stuff like that. It kind of defeats the if you're allowed to do that, but I can't put other housing on there, so I don't understand why that why that rule is there.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good point. You know, a lot of our R3 and R4 zones are along either arterials or collectors where it may make sense to do one of these uses. Historically, some of these may have already been built, and so they have that zoning because, you know, they were already built and then they got zoned that. As well as these are often the kinds of uses that will work well, like complementary to an apartment complex, for example, where you might actually want to combine some of these things into the same property, especially if you have a larger property, rather than, you know, going exclusively residential. This allows you to kind of combine uses, and so, you know, we have not taken a look at your question in terms of exactly how much potential acreage are we, you know, taking out of the equation to do residential by allowing these, but, you know, it's certainly not uncommon to have medium to high density zones allow for some kind of use that's complementary to residential, but doesn't require only residential.
Is there a waiver process for any of these changes?
There's not a waiver process currently in the code, no. Somebody could come in and just pull a building permit for these.
But if it wasn't single family housing and they wanted to put, I don't know, fourplexes or something on there, and they don't make the density, there's no waiver process for it.
Correct, other than if they have the wetlands or, you know, the other, some kind of natural feature, or the configuration is such, like if you have a lot with a lot of points and triangles and it makes it difficult, then you can come to staff and say, because of the layout of this particular lot, we're not able to achieve 60% minimum density, and so we want to argue to go lower. That is in there. It's not called a waiver. It's an exception but that part is currently in the code.
And staff makes that decision?
Staff makes that, yeah.
Thank you.
I think just a small clarification, where it says professional office, that's not really an office building, right? It would be like a home?
No, it would be an office building. It'd be.
Okay. Joel?
So Brad, I wouldn't ask for this information today, but when it comes before the council to take action on it, we have targets on housing, correct? We've established targets.
We do.
And under the different scenarios, we have a potential at fully developed, and I don't know how that relates to the target. Doesn't mean they're all going to be developed. The other statistic that would be important, if they're minimally developed, how does that relate to the target? And so I think that would be useful information for me. I don't require it today because it's going to take a little bit of work, but we set those targets for a reason, and I'd like to use that as kind of a decision criteria for where we're at and what we're doing.
Sure, Counselor. We'll look at that.
And Valerie?
Yeah, I just have a question on the, on slide 19. It says reconsider the 10,000 square foot lot exemption. Can you explain to me how that, as an alternate approach, what that means?
Well, the way that it was worded, when it came to the planning, when it came to you from the Planning Commission, this is a change that I believe the council made. With the Planning Commission, I could be wrong on that, but I think that when it came to you, what it said was any lot that's in the R3 or the R4 that is 10,000 or below is not required to comply with the 60% rule. So it's alternative approach in that if your concern is that this is overregulation or that this gets into a lot of minutia and a lot of variances and things like that, then by taking the 10,000 square foot lot or less out of the equation, you know, you are talking about a significant number of lots. that would no longer be subject to the code, but you wouldn't necessarily be repealing the entire minimum density code. You would just be taking out that piece. Now, on the other flip side, there is a lot of acreage, and cumulatively, if you add up everything that's under 10,000 square feet, it's quite a bit of property. That was on that other slide. So I think that was the argument for why council kept it.
Okay.
Any other questions at the moment? All right, I think we'll have our Home Builders Association representatives come up, and then Housing Advisory Committee. Thanks for being here today.
Is it on? Okay, I see the tape on there, I wasn't sure. How's everyone doing today? Justin Gerlitz, representing Home Builders Association today, and we've been having a lot of discussions on this. I know I've had some of these discussions, small portions of them to council. I've talked to individual councilors, and one of the things I've had is a lot of experience through my own office on middle housing, and I think this all relates together, so I'm hoping I can share a little bit of that today with everybody, just to help with this discussion. So minimum density was created at a time where we didn't have any of these new things. And when I say new things, we didn't have middle housing, we didn't have middle housing land divisions, and we didn't have what I don't think Brad touched on is the current code changes that are coming to you, I believe, in the next, I don't know where Brad went, 2 months, Article 12 code changes. 2 months, are also going to significantly affect lot sizes in the R3 and R4 zone, minimum lot sizes. So one of the things that was discussed in the past with minimum density is it used to be 5,000 square foot minimum lot size for single family residential. So I think one of the concerns that came up during that discussion a couple years ago was, well, people were building single family homes to the 5,000 square foot minimum lot size, therefore affecting potential density. Well, now the minimum lot sizes are going to be going down to 2,600 square feet in those R3, R4 zones. So essentially, you can still have single family at a very high density. So I think that's a big change. But middle housing, I think, has been the biggest change that we've seen. So you've got middle housing now allows for dense multifamily residential in every single residential zone in the city. And you go, wow, that's great. Well, I've actually had 5 or 6 applications now along those lines through my office. And I wanted to share with you the effect of that. So all of these examples are not in the R3, R4 zone. They're in the R18 to R112 zones. So we've got a cottage development that's been approved on Fruitdale. Maximum density based on the lot size there was 8 units. And these are maximums. We are putting in 12 cottage units that are going to be on individual lots. So you have a 50% increase in density on that one. Also to mention on that one, it was off of a flag lot, which originally would not have allowed us to do any more than 4 units because that's the maximum you can do off of a narrow private street. We just got another subdivision approved through Planning Commission off of Grandview. Maximum density is 17 lots. We did create 17 lots, but the owner is intending to do duplexes. So essentially we've doubled the number of units that is allowed in that R110 zone. I've got another small partition on Hawthorne, maximum density 4 units. It has 2 houses on it right now. We're going to be doing 6 units. And then I've got another one on Redwood Avenue that we're essentially doubling the units on as well from 9 to 17. So these are all non-R3, R4 zones. And as I've stated before, coming before you, I truly believe that middle housing is making all of this minimum density stuff almost irrelevant. We have the opportunity now, as people develop, as they need to, as circumstances come before them, you can now take your backyard in the northeast portion of the town. A lot of the houses up there have these big giant backyards. And I could put 3 more units back there, before it was just an ADU. So I just think that as we're discussing minimum density, regulating it to a point where you have to build multi-family apartments like in the R4 zone, that's what essentially we're saying in those bigger lots is you have to go multi-story, multi-family apartments to hit those 60% minimum targets. Through experience, the cost of doing those units just doesn't make sense. then that's the reason the only projects we have seen that occur in are these, government-funded type projects, these housing authority projects. And even those they cost a substantial amount of money per unit. It's good that we're doing them. It's good that we have the funding for them. But from a private industry perspective, they don't make sense, and that's why we don't have them. Or people would for sure build them. The zoning transition overlay, the discussion on that, we could look at the numbers. We say, hey, we're gonna cut our acreage down by changing everything back to what it was. But again, I don't think that really has an impact anymore. It did at the time, it doesn't anymore. Middle housing land divisions that Brad mentioned, I've got a couple of those, several of those on the screen were projects through our office. Those are now allowing us to actually split little small units. We'll use cottages, for example, although a fourplex, you can do the same thing, where you actually split down the property line, even if it's in the backyard of somebody's house that's currently there. So now we actually have better home ownership options through that process that are going to have a significant impact on what we're doing density-wise. And you don't have to have lot frontage, which is a huge change over the past, where you had to have 20 feet minimum on the street. Again, these lot size changes that are coming here in a couple months are going to make the lots that used to be 5,050 feet wide, they're going to drop down to 25 feet wide. So that's going to have a substantial impact on density, increasing density in our city without the minimum density rules applying. I think, what we're trying to accomplish from the home builder's perspective is not limiting what you can do with a piece of property. As I personally know, every single property and every single ownership situation has it's a different situation for everybody. You can look at a piece of property and say, hey, that's perfect for an apartment complex. But if somebody owns it, it's not an apartment complex developer, and the numbers don't make sense, they won't develop it. And I think the ultimate goal of the home builders is to build homes, any type of home, from an apartment, from an something with government assistance, all the way up to a single family home that's larger in the right location. So what we're trying to accomplish is ultimately taking some of the restriction out of the minimum density that forces a certain type of housing and allowing housing to occur as it should develop throughout the city, especially using these new codes that are in place. I know the last thing that I will mention as an example, Chad Hansen's home bridging group, we're looking at a piece of property right now that is R4 that he wants to do some senior living cottages on, home ownership type cottages, to help seniors that are trapped in their homes that are falling apart around them, allowing them to move out of a bigger home that's dilapidated into a smaller home on a piece of property through their program. And the particular project we're looking at that we just so happen to get a piece of property that's working with the ARPA dollars is not allowing us to develop them like that because of minimum density. We've got 22 cottages proposed, and with minimum density, we have to have 36. And with the parking that goes along with, increasing density, every time we go up a level, you have to go out as well for parking. And so it's kind of a forcing you into almost a 3-story situation, apartment complex situation. So it's just another example of a really, really good project for the community with higher density compared to single family, but still not meeting those targets. So I just want to throw all that out there for consideration because I think it's very, very important to the future of how we develop our housing altogether in our city. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Questions? No questions? All right, thanks,
you.
Justin.
Did-
Okay.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about I have to say who I am, don't I?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm Gail Atkins. I'm the Home Builders President. And just talking on behalf of our town, but I want to talk that, I want to say, looking at the long game, the very, very long game, because I've been developing properties since 1981, which is 42 years, but I was only 12 on the first one. So, so that was in Jackson County. And then I've been in real estate sales and helping developers for all those years. And so during that time, we've seen a lot of political changes about development. We had a no-growth policy, or a lot of activists, no growth here in Josephine County back in the 80s. It was, you couldn't get anything hardly done. There'd be 100 people in here saying no to everything. And so that didn't help us create any housing. And I just want to say what I have observed in the sales end all this time is when a community gets kind of tough and no growth or kind of highly regulated, the development goes somewhere else. That's what it does. You can't force development. You cannot. It just cannot be done, period. And you can question me on that. So I was really happy Brad brought up the towns that have this similar, or 60% of the maximum. But what he didn't tell, or put on that I could see, was Central Point doesn't have it, Eagle Point doesn't have it, Talent doesn't have it, Phoenix doesn't have it, Rogue River doesn't have it, Cave Junction doesn't have it, and White City doesn't have it. So over these years that I've been observing development, it just shifts to where it's development friendly. And if we want housing, which we want really bad, we want the jobs, we want the units, we want to be development friendly. And what is not development friendly is overregulation, as Councillor Pell talked about. We also need a new type, and I'm just going to bring this up briefly today. We need a new type of housing, and it's called group housing or dormitory style housing. I'll come back later on that because I'm going to try to get something like that done, where we can get the unit cost down to maybe $90,000 per, instead of the new project on Harbeck is $400,000 per unit. It was supposed to be $350,000. The latest word is it's $400,000, which is more than single-family homes. It's a lot of single-family homes. So we need to have open mind about different kinds of housing. And I think we need to become, if we want it, we need to become a housing and development friendly community, not go this direction with this, this minimum requirement that I think has really not helped. I think it's hurt. Its intention was to help. Everything you guys do is, the intention is to help. But the reality is sometimes it goes, whoops, it doesn't help. It creates a problem. And that's what I think has happened with this minimum 60% rule. Any questions? DJ?
Yeah, thanks for coming in. We need to know exactly what the Home Builders Association is recommending regarding middle housing. We heard Justin mention that we need to be cautious of limiting development, et cetera. Do you have an exact recommendation that you would like to see with middle housing in the community?
On middle housing?
I'm sorry, minimum density.
Oh, minimum? Oh, at least get rid of it down to that 10,000 lot, the 10,000 square foot lot. At least exempt that. I just don't think it's necessary because things end up market driven anyway. We're only going to get a few big government projects. To get those big projects, I think I've told you, it takes 40, they only fund 1 out of 40 applications. We're never going to get enough of that. So I think we need to look at market as driving, the market driving housing. And so I think the middle housing allows 4 units on any lot. I mean, it allows a lot. And allowing is a pretty good idea. Trying to force is it's a no good idea. So did I answer your question? Well, you can ask it again.
Sure. Well, yeah, I think that's one portion, and we considered it when we talked about minimum density, the 10,000 square foot lot.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it addressed a portion of it. So in the presentation on slide 19, it mentions one thing to consider would be a 10,000 square foot lot exemption for minimum density. And that's a great recommendation, but it's bigger than that. There's many considerations to make. And I just want to know exactly what the Home Builders Association would like to see regarding all facets of minimum density.
I'd have to defer that to Justin because
Sure.
he's the brains of the outfit, as you guys probably have already figured out. So if you have another question of me, then we'll let him come up again if that's okay.
Rob, did you have a question?
So when you mentioned, Gail, towns that are not necessarily development-friendly, limiting development, what policies would you say from 2000 to 2015 in Grants Pass was limited development, weren't development-friendly? In what ways was the city of Grants Pass not development-friendly?
I'm not sure when the 60% minimum rule came in. I'm not sure. Does anybody know? That hasn't helped. I don't think there's been very much
I think it was just last April.
done.
Last April.
Yeah.
I guess the reason that I ask is that with the, pretty much tripling in population from the mid-90s till now, this is kind of where we got our deficit on housing units. And I'm just wondering, do we attribute that mostly because developers wanted to do single-family houses and that put us behind the 8 ball? Or was Grants Pass in some way making it too difficult for developers to do multifamily? Because we ended up in the last, we're way behind now. We weren't, I don't believe we were way behind in the mid-90s. So whatever policies we had between then and now have contributed to us being in the situation we're in. So I'm trying to clarify in my mind.
I'm going to speak again on the big picture, okay? So, for example, in the dormitory-style housing I was mentioning, until World War II, 50% of Americans lived part of their life in that kind of housing, boarding house, dormitory style. And then World War II to the 90s, we had the biggest economic boom that's ever occurred on the planet to any people that ever existed, and still exist. So we got used to 2-bedroom, our own bath, our own garage, everything, we got used to that. But the economic boom that supported that ended in the 90s. So we have a new economic reality. And this is, again, my opinion, but it's not, I didn't just invent this. So the problem is cost is just going up and up and up and up, and incomes aren't going up and up. They really kind of haven't caught up or stayed with the cost of development and food now and everything else. That really has just become a serious, serious problem. So that's why we are short of housing. It's a purely economic, it's mostly an economic problem. What can you do, or what can a government do to help alleviate it? I think is incentivize it. Incentivize us, work with us, which is really good. We've had a lot of progress with you guys and us. But work with us, get some more infrastructure, because you're the only body that has the kind of hundreds of thousands of dollars to put in a water and a sewer line, or maybe $500,000. It just doesn't exist in the private sector. So, and I know there were times when I've lived here when all of a sudden wow, we have a water and sewer line going right up Allen Creek. Well, when did that happen and why? I think the city just decided eventually we're going to need it out there, so it's out there. And I don't know how long it's been out there, 25, 30 years. And now we're finally going to get a road so we can use that. But so this community, the county and the city has invested big money in infrastructure over my career, the time I've been in before probably. So that would help. The city has access to money that we in the private sector don't have access to. So that could help keep costs down, roads and sewer and water and, that kind of stuff would really, really be helpful. But the cost of construction of a home here in Portland is the same, but the incomes are way, way different, okay? So if you're developing for rentals, here someone can afford to pay $500 or $600 a month rent on an income, and maybe in Portland that same job would pay twice as much, so they could pay twice as much, but that building costs the same. Does everybody understand that? Do you all understand that? That's real? That's not us making it up, that's just it. A sheet of plywood costs the same here as in Portland. Gasoline costs the same. Labor is about the same. Roofing and all the materials that go into it are the same. Concrete's the same. So the problem is our incomes have not kept up with the cost. So we just need to be as friendly as we can be to development, open-minded, deregulate as much as possible, and just try to get people housed in whatever way we can, and be real practical about it. That's my advice.
Rick?
I'm sorry.
So Gail, thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
So my question for you, would we really be having this conversation if there was an abundance of vacant land and people were knocking at your door trying to sell their land to you at reasonable prices because there is an abundance of land that you could then build your single-family dwellings on, and therefore, because of the overabundance, the higher density lands could be preserved for that very purpose?
Oh boy. So getting more developable lands will certainly help. But a lot of times land is about 20 to 25% of our total. So if we get land, at 20% cheaper, it's going to help, but it isn't going to solve the problem. But more available lands and more infrastructure are the two things that you guys would more available lands because you can get the urban growth boundary done. And infrastructure, you guys can do that. And hold back on the regulations, you can do that. Those are things I think you can do. And the rest of it, we have to work out in the private sector and be creative. We have to be really creative.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Brian has a question. He's on the phone.
Oh, where is he?
Thank you. I was just curious, I'm seeing other places locally like Central Point and Medford, and, when I'm driving around, I'm seeing a lot of multifamily development, and, clearly we're not seeing it here. So why, and this is, for you, Gail, or even for Justin or anyone really, why is it happening so much more in those places that have very similar incomes to here, but it's not happening here?
I'd have to say, I don't know which projects you're talking about over there. The Jackson County Housing Authority's been pretty active, and maybe you're seeing that. I don't really know how many more permits, so I can't say he's right or wrong, because I don't know. I'd have to talk to Jackson County and ask how many multifamily permits are you getting compared to how many single-family or other commercial or other types of permits. And so in my driving around, I wouldn't say I've seen substantially more over there, but I don't drive every road every day, so I can't, well, what?
All right.
It doesn't matter what they're doing, I guess he's saying. Yeah, we're doing our best because we want a job, and our investors want to invest in projects that give them some return. So we're pro-housing, that's what we're all about. Okay.
Okay, I think I have two follow-up questions for Justin.
I think,
I'm running the meeting.
Are you waiting for Justin?
Yeah, let's
Okay.
get Justin.
Okay.
All right, Justin, so if you could please address, DJ had a question about any specific recommendations, and then also if you could follow up on Brian's question,
Yeah.
whether you have any knowledge of what Central Point or something might be doing differently than us.
Yeah, I think to follow up on DJ's question, and thank you for asking for clarification, right? That's what we're here for. Is our recommendation is let's eliminate the forced minimum density and let's incentivize higher density. Some incentives that have been discussed recently are something that's easy, like deferring SDC and maybe even permit costs till certificate of occupancy. One of the things that comes with any development is the high upfront cost versus what you get out of it when you start renting, say, in the end. So something simple like that, no cost to the city, essentially, outside of a delay. reduce system development charges and fees for multifamily housing. And I think we should really look at multifamily housing not always as 5 units or more, but I think it should be minimum dense or middle housing as well. Quadplexes, triplexes, cottage clusters. In regards to Brian's question, we've got a very different. It's not. I won't say it's as different as Portland, of course, but minimum incomes in Josephine County are much lower than Jackson County, especially when you start working over to Ashland. Ashland was discussed today. For instance, I look at a lot of things. They're selling some cottages right now in Ashland, I believe, for $700,000. Whereas here, we're hoping to get $250 to $290 for a cottage. Ashland's a special place. Ashland's part of Jackson County. Incomes are incredibly high. Not so much working incomes, but local incomes, the money that's brought into that city. Every city is very different. Central Point was mentioned. Central Point is a very, very developer-friendly city in Southern Oregon. I'd probably say it's one of the most developer-friendly cities in Southern Oregon. And it has grown tremendously in the last 10 years. We need to continue to focus on making our city very, very development-friendly. Have we done some things to do that? Yes. I think what Gail mentioned is, I've been around here for a long time too. We had long periods of time where people fought projects. Fought them tooth and nail, appealed them to LUBA. Thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars went into these things. Some people had to drop out because they couldn't fight the fight, even though they had really good projects. I feel like right now, locally, we're in a different position. I think globally, I think people see that our housing need is real here and in all of Southern Oregon and most of the West Coast. So I think by getting rid of thou shalt do this type of housing or this type of project on this type of land, we need to get with the spirit of what the state's telling us to do, which is make it extremely flexible across the board. Let people do what they're going to do. Why do we not have large apartment complexes here? We don't have large tracts of land. Most of the apartment complexes that have been built in Medford area are pretty big, hundreds of units, a couple hundred units. You get economies of scale with that kind of project. It takes a very special kind of developer for that kind of project to invest that many millions of dollars to building something like that. We don't seem to have that here. What we do have is we have smaller builders and we have smaller investors. And again, just to reiterate, I think that middle housing is going to be a substantial tool for us to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish, which is higher density. I just don't want to see us taking these R3, R4 lands, saying you have to put apartments on them and letting them sit for another 20 years, because if so, we're going to have this discussion again in another 10 or 20 years. And I'd rather see the type of housing that needs to be built. The market drives that so strongly. We could say we need apartments. I think if apartments were financially feasible, they'd be built. And I say personally, I would build them. If you said, wow, apartments make sense, let's build them. I'm looking at my kids here in town that are that age, live in apartments, and there's hardly anywhere for them to live. Most of them are sharing rooms places. So anyways, hope that's helpful. And if there's any additional questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Any other questions? All right, thank you. Chad, did you want to jump in on this? No, thank you. Is there anyone from Housing Advisory Committee who wanted to talk? Tom?
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor, Council. I'm Tom Bradbeer from Ward 4. Go Ward 4. I'd like to talk about a few ideas that come from the Housing Advisory Committee. I'm the Vice Chair of the Housing Advisory Committee, and I was sorry to see Doug leave. He had a few thoughts he wanted to share with you, but I will talk about incentives for multiple unit property development. This was a topic that the Housing Advisory Committee discussed, and we have discussed it before. There are 3 specific targeted and actionable policy recommendations that we'd like to present. And this is based on the home builders' proposal to create incentives for multi-unit development. The city adopted the housing production strategy last spring that was developed by the consulting firm Econ Northwest with the support of a local advisory committee that helped in the development of that plan. One of the recommendations in the housing production strategy plan is to modify the city's current affordable housing program, which, as you know, is funded by the sale of city property. Currently, the very narrow and restrictive criteria for the use of that program makes it essentially available only for low-income housing tax credit projects. We're recommending that this program be expanded, and the policy should include high-density, market-rate, multi-unit development in selected sections of the city. This incentive for increased density could be quite effective. The fund has been accumulating and could be broadened to include market rate, multi-unit development. And the impact of that is to reduce fees and SDCs. So the second proposal complements that, and this is to create a sliding scale of development fees and SDCs that provides incentive for multi-unit development. The sliding scale would basically set fees and SDCs at a higher rate for low-density development and a lower rate for high-density development. Theoretically, there's a way to structure that progressive rate structure to be revenue neutral. That is, the higher rate for low density would offset the lower rate for high density. The problem is it might work. That is, if it works and the development is primarily higher density, then there wouldn't be the revenue from the lower density to offset that. So there is a further recommendation, excuse me, and that is to provide a reserve fund from the sale of property that was not purchased with Parks SDCs, and to apply that using a point system that would include criteria adopted by the council for density and the type of development that the council prefers. Third recommendation is probably the most controversial, but potentially the most effective, and that is to provide the MUPT. Everything has an acronym now. The multiple unit property tax exemption. A short-term targeted policy that allows the city to offer a partial property tax exemption limited to the value of the housing, not the land, to projects that meet locally determined criteria such as high density. The state law that enables this allows the council to establish perhaps a 2 to 3 year partial property tax exemption, which would apply only to the city's portion of property taxes, which comprise about 42% of the total. If 51% of the overlapping districts agreed to join in providing that exemption, then the entire property tax bill could be postponed for 2 to 3 years. This provides a real benefit for developers in that that first 2 to 3 year period is a difficult one in terms of cash flow particularly. So a 2 to 3 year property tax exemption on the value of the property, that the building that is developed meeting criteria established by the council, could be a very important incentive. There are sources of funds that could help provide support for that. The URA housing component is one of them. Those funds are quite limited, and there are certainly many other competing uses for URA funds. But having 3 policies in place, expand the housing affordability policy, create a sliding scale of development fees, and implement the multiple unit property tax exemption could provide the incentive that will lead to more multiple unit development in Grants Pass. I'm sorry Doug had to leave. He had some other thoughts that he was going to present, but I'm sure he can provide those later. Thank you.
Thanks. Any questions for Tom? Vanessa?
Thanks, Tom. I think you were on Housing Advisory Committee in the lead up to the adoption of the minimum density ordinance on council. Can you talk about the work that Housing Advisory Committee did to get that in front of the council?
Well, I didn't bring the complete review of all of that history, but there are many other communities in Oregon that have a similar approach, and it's important to look at the experience of those communities. And a couple of years ago, when the Housing Advisory Committee first talked about this, there was research done. But as Jason has pointed out, there are a lot of changes that have occurred lately. We have a lot of different laws, a lot of changes in zoning that really require that that be reviewed. But the Housing Advisory Committee did not again address that issue recently. It could, but I think the notion was to talk about incentives for multiple unit property development, regardless of whether there is a minimum or not. The incentives can still be effective, even if there isn't a minimum for that particular property.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, thanks, Tom. Oh, Valerie?
Tom, I'm going to have you clarify something just really quick, because you went through those pretty fast.
Yeah, I did.
And that's good. And you kind of went back, but I
In
just want to say,
respect of
so
your
you were
time.
saying the three. The first one was broaden the
The SDC waiver
SDC
program.
waiver,
Yeah.
and not only have it go to low-income projects that require federal tax credits, but to broaden it just for any high density, regardless of income? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, regardless of income,
Okay.
but not necessarily just any. The council, with staff recommendation, should develop specific criteria for eligibility for that. And they should be clear and objective criteria.
Okay. The second one was a sliding scale for, which perhaps would have the lower density have higher fees, and the higher density have lower fees. That kind of
Right. When we
sums up.
first talked about that, the idea was that it could be revenue neutral.
Okay.
But as I said, it might work, and therefore there wouldn't be much development with the higher fees.
Okay. And then the third one was, of course, the MUPT, which I'm familiar with, having gone through and been on that committee, which gives a 2 to 3 year property tax exemption to people who are building low, high density structures. And so I get that. What confused me, and you also talked about the create a reserve fund. Was that under the sliding scale?
Well,
I guess I didn't see where that exactly how that
I
fit
see.
in.
Yeah, there needs to be a backfill of the lost revenue if the sliding scale works. And that backfill could come from the Urban Renewal Agency. It could come from a portion of the proceeds from the sale of city-owned property. I originally thought the CET might be able to be involved, but no, apparently not.
Okay. And then you just talked about having a point system that helped
Right.
set the criteria.
To make it clear, to
Okay.
be sure that it's objective,
Okay.
and to allow consistent application of the council's criteria to every project.
Okay, thank you. That helps.
Rob?
I have a question. I'm not sure if it's for Tom or for Brad or maybe Aaron, but I know 4 or 5 years ago, I wrote a letter to the council before I was on the council suggesting the short-term property tax exemption for higher density projects. And if we have a piece of property that is essentially vacant, or we'll say underperforming from a tax perspective, and a development went on that piece of property, what negative impacts would the city feel by having a short-term property tax exemption? Because it would be on a property that isn't necessarily performing well in the tax rolls now anyway.
Right.
So what's the negative there? Do we have any ideas, Brad or someone else, or maybe Tom?
I certainly will defer to staff here, but I think the point is that there is no significant property tax receipt from that property undeveloped. So the exemption really isn't a long-term or permanent exemption. It's a temporary, and so it delays the revenue that would come from that project. Rather than starting with the certificate of occupancy, it would be delayed a couple of years.
Yeah, I understand that. Now I'm just asking, I don't see any negative to doing that. Is
Well,
Brad or someone else here?
I might
explain
just
what's wrong
add
with
to
that?
it, actually, because I was on that committee and we did discuss it. The negative to that, especially in Josephine County, is our public safety is based upon our property taxes, and 74% of the land belongs to the federal government. So we're more limited than most areas. So what we're basically sacrificing is property tax, which is public safety funding. So that was one of the things that was brought up, was that fact.
I guess, I appreciate that, Val, but I guess what I'm asking, the properties that I was thinking of were already in the city limits. There would be essentially not much more mileage on public safety vehicles because they're already going in those areas anyway. Yeah, there would be some more people, and so there'd be some more public safety activity, but I think it would probably be minimal. So I'm just not sure if I see much negative there unless someone can point it out, but.
Did you want Brad to answer that, or?
Well, I was hoping Brad or someone.
Okay.
Yeah, if there is a reason.
I don't have really at this point anything else to add. I think there's some other research and conversations with the assessor that we'd like to have, if that's something you'd like us to look into. But I think the main comments have already been touched on. Amber may have looked into this a little bit as well, so if we could have her, if that's possible.
Yeah, did you want to touch on that, Amber?
So you are correct in that you take a vacant lot, very minimal taxes going towards public safety of the city in general, and you're exempting them from those taxes for the year date that council sets. And council can set that up to 10 years under MUPD, but it is council's decision. It can be as low as you want. Council can also decide, if we do pass MUPD, when to use it. It doesn't have to be every high density units that go in get applied. Council can say we're only going to do 2 this year, or 1, or we're only going to do 1 every other year. So council gets pretty much total control of this program. So if we want to designate it for large lots that are 5+ acres or something like that, council gets that designation. The benefit then afterwards, so we take these lots that are minimal tax paying. We do have a couple years where we have increased the density of people without increasing that immediate funding to the police department and other city services. However, after the period is over, we have basically encouraged that development that may not have happened before, and we are now getting a much larger tax increase to what we're receiving, what the police are receiving. So again, it can really influence the development that maybe wouldn't have happened before and largely increase. And as we see in research, the higher density tends to supplement the lower density in terms of how much is being paid for those services. So those higher density spots in town tend to pay for more than just their own services.
So I guess we're also in a point now where it may be that public safety may be significantly funded by means that are not driven by property taxes. We may be reaching that soon, in which case the negative that I'm hearing wouldn't really exist if it was more of a utility fee or some kind of sales or beverage tax or things like that, from beverage tax. Then the negative would actually go away on something like that, from what I can gather, unless someone can correct me.
I don't think that's really a question for you. All right, Rick, did you have a question?
No, I was wondering when we're going to go into discussion.
Okay, I think we're there now. Oh, did you have another comment,
If I could
Amber?
just make a couple comments following up from the Housing Advisory in defense of the minimum density. Where we really see it protecting the most is the multifamily housing, those 5+ units. I just want to commend the housing builders in grants past, because the middle housing is our only category currently that is not only meeting but exceeding our growth projection needs according to the housing needs analysis. So they've really taken these new types of housing and ran with it, and it's been excellent. So where I'm getting at is that where we really need to just pay attention is multifamily housing is difficult to get. We know that, so I kind of treat it like triage. When we get calls from developers of multifamily here at the city, largely they're asking for 10-plus acres, which we really don't have here in Grants Pass. We're very parcelized, and we have a lot of slopes and farmland preventing us from moving out to getting those larger acres anytime soon. So I do just want to throw out there that we kind of treat those larger, high zoned lots as endangered species. There is definitely wiggle room for adjustment because we don't want to prevent. We are also not meeting for single-family home development in our goals as well. We do need to help bolster that as well. But we do want to make sure that when we're looking at multifamily, they don't get developed often. When they do get developed, they're heavy hitters to our new unit increase. But we're looking even 20 to 50 years down the line, where are those lots going to be and how can we make sure that they're available when they're needed? Questions?
Okay. Any questions?
Or do you?
Valerie?
So currently we have, of course, we have Cathedral Square, which is that, and we are also going back through the Chrisman development, which would be 60. There's another one in the hopper too, as we say, that is currently in process. And how many units is that?
That is 68 ideally. The downside with that, or upside or downside, those are all income restricted. Where I really have been pushing this year is I need us to get some market rate multifamily housing, because that's where our kids who are just graduating from high school and want to start their first jobs, that's where they're looking and they're not finding. That's where our seniors, when they're retiring and they don't have enough to maintain their own home and haven't paid it off, that's where they're looking and not finding. So we have a really nice next 5 to 10 year continuum for affordable housing that's income restricted, but that is still limited. We have, like I said, college students don't qualify for low-income tax credit units because they're going to school full-time. So we still need market rate apartments. And yes, as they get built, the prices, initially you get sticker shock, but if we're not building them, they're not depreciating. And our older multifamily apartments are naturally occurring affordable housing that you don't have to go through the rigmarole of low-income housing to qualify for. You can still afford to live there.
And just a quick question as well. As the income restricted fill up, a lot of times they will be coming from other apartments. Yes, no? I mean, I'm just kind of wondering what the move-up factor is, how that factors in.
So income restricted, it depends. If we have a market or a multifamily income restricted, yeah, we do see quite a few people as they move up, you know, they get better jobs and they move out. If they're 62 and older, my experience working at them is you're waiting for people to pass away to get a new spot to fill in, by and large.
Thank you. You do want to bring? Yes.
You have to step up to the
You have
mic,
to step to
please.
the mic, yeah.
I would like to respond to the moving up comment. The Jackson County Housing Authority has 4,000 people waiting in line. They can't move up, per Jason Elzey, conversation Justin and I had with Jason a couple weeks ago. With the income restriction limits, people can't get out of it, because if they move up, there's no housing for them to go to.
Okay.
And so the inventory or the waiting list continues to grow. So the need for the median income of really 80% to 120 is the largest gap we have.
Okay.
And that's the gap that continues to grow.
Okay.
And so just building more low-income apartments isn't going to change anything.
Which is kind of, isn't that workforce, considered workforce housing? Is up to 120%?
Today, a nurse at Asante can't buy a house in Josephine County. So the median house sale this summer was $432,000 with interest rates, cost of building. They can't do it. So you have to have my houses. I sell houses at a median price of $264,000 with 2 points or 3 points of interest advantage from Evergreen Federal, and you have to make 60 to 70,000 depending on your debt to income to buy one of my houses. So how many jobs out there are paying between $60,000 and $70,000 on a single income in our town, or two incomes? So you got to incentivize, or this ain't changing.
All right, you were popping up, Amber, are you done?
I just wasn't sure if there's any more questions.
Oh, okay. I think we're ready to move into discussion, but they may have more questions. Marty, were you wanting to talk? No? Okay. Go ahead, Rick.
So I agree with Amber on the taxes. I think having two aspects there, as Tom Bradbury said, incentives, and I could see postponing taxes for 2 years. And if it made the development occur rather than the development not occurring, then in the long run, public safety would be better off. Another aspect, if somebody has a piece of property that they're not able to develop it to, I would say, the density they want, zoning changes can go both ways. You could downzone as well as upzone. So that opportunity would be there if you have a specific piece of property. I think one of our biggest problems, and it always has been, and I don't see it changing, as it was mentioned, there's lack of 10-acre lots out there, but there's basically a lack of abundance of vacant land, whether you're doing single-family dwelling or any development out there. So I could see the council opening up the doors for expansion in the urban growth boundary to provide a larger inventory of land, and that would help. But one of the other aspects on there that's discussed, I'm still supportive of retaining the 60% density in the R3 and R4 zones, because those were designated that, and it's been mentioned, the infrastructure is there. The size of the sewer, the size of the water, and as you go out of town, if you're going to say you're going to start taking multifamily out of town, then you don't have the infrastructure. So who's going to pay for the extension of the infrastructure further out of town? It comes very expensive. So I would still be in favor of requiring the higher density and retaining the R3 and R4 zones where they're currently located. But that's just a perspective that I have. Thank you.
Valerie?
Well, I'm going to respectfully disagree with you, Rick, just because I really believe that it is the middle housing that is going to get us out of it. It is going to be our local builders. I remember when Store Ready a couple years ago was trying to bring in a bunch of big developers from other communities. They didn't want to come because they looked at the numbers and they looked at our income level and they knew that there was not going to be a return on their investment. You know, people invest money to make money. And I know, you know, in the perfect world, maybe that wouldn't be the case, but that is the case, and that's how our system works. And I really believe that incentivizing and working with people on their individual lots will go farther. I mean, I can see if we have a couple of 10-acre pieces and saying, yes, let's keep that for, but we don't. And so what is happening in our community now is that middle housing has opened up, is we are seeing people say, hey, you know, I've got this, I could put some more houses, I can do something with it and I can get more. And you know, right now another issue that, you know, is the state laws on, you know, but you can only raise rates 10%. I mean, that is brutal to a developer who's investing a lot of money and has a lot of costs go up, like public safety and this and that, whatever, and can't get a return on their money. And in this state, I don't think you're going to bring in a bunch of multifamily builders under those circumstances. I think our best bet is to work with our local contractors and stay with as many incentives as we possibly can, other than maybe big lots or whatever, to have that be our strategy. So I'm into incentivizing.
DJ?
Yeah, it seems pretty clear to me. We need to eliminate limitations on these things. Incentivize is the key. Anything that's prohibiting, including, but not limited to this minimum density ordinance needs to go away.
Dwayne?
I would agree with Valerie and DJ. We need to make some changes. Not all R3 and R4 have structure there. I'd disagree with Councilor Riker, that we need to at least have at the minimum a waiver process or something to allow these people to builders to build and stop restricting them, or we're going to be back here and some of you won't even be alive when we finally get to the housing that we need here. So let's stop restricting and start incentivizing.
Brian?
Thank you. So as far as I understand it, the current minimum density ordinance does have language in there for exceptions. So if there's some reason a developer cannot meet minimum density in an R3 or R4 zone, there's language in there to take that into account. With regards to the 10,000 square foot and lower exemption, I remember when we talked about that when we were making the decision, and I don't remember the exact number, but I want to say somewhere in the neighborhood of 2/3 to 3/4 of those R3, R4 lots were below 10,000 square feet. So we did not exempt them because that would have exempted the majority of what we were trying to do. I will say what I am in favor of. I thought there were some good ideas today about broadening the allowable uses for the surplus property sale fund. I like the idea of lowering the fees and SDCs for multifamily projects. I would like us to explore potentially the MUPD tax exemption. I think that could be a useful tool. And then I also do have a concern. Dwayne brought this up, and I appreciate you bringing this up, Dwayne. The fact that the R3 and the R4 zones essentially can also be used as a commercial zone. So I think it might warrant more discussion on if we want to have some sort of like safeguards on that. You know, maybe a certain percentage of those properties need to be residential. And, you know, so it's more of a mixed use requirement as opposed to, you know, just leaving it open for a professional office building to come in and buy R3 and R4 land and take it out of our housing land stock. So that's where I'm at. Thank you.
DJ?
I have to clarify that, to my knowledge, there are no exemptions in the minimum density. There's no discretion or exemption whatsoever in that code.
What's up, Brad? Can you address that?
The only one is if you have a site that has physical constraints and literally doesn't allow for you to hit the target, then you can't. But it's not. It doesn't get you out of meeting as many dwelling units as you possibly can. You still have to shoot for that maximum number, but it does have the exception allowed at the staff level to drop the number below 60 if you prove through a site plan that your site has those constraints on it. And that might be easements, the huge utility easements sometimes get in the way of, you know, large extra wide utility easements. It could be extra, you know, configuration of the lot that you just literally can't construct a unit there. But that's the only waiver.
Dwayne?
Well, I think some of us know why Chad's here today, and he has that exact same property up there in Schoolville. He wants it changed to put the max amount of density he could put in there today. And I mean, there needs to be a waiver today for him to start building. I mean, we're restricting this process for people to build. You know, I don't see no reason why he can't have a proposal up within a week or two to us in the council and say, hey, this is a great opportunity for elderly. It's not like he's want to put single family housing up. He wants to put multiple housing up there for elderly. But right now he can't do that because there's no waiver process for that. So we need to think about that change immediately and when we see something like this, let's fix it. Let's not sit around for 6 months or a year wondering about why we haven't fixed it. This is an easy fix for certain houses that we want. He's not like he's asking for single-family housing. It's multifamily. Let's fix those easy things right
Can you
away.
explain a little bit more? I'm not sure everyone's familiar with that project.
So, I mean, I think Justin will be able to talk more about it, but it's up in Scoville. What's it?
Within a town.
You want to I think Justin can talk about it better than I could. He's the engineer for that.
Okay, I think
They
that
have
was,
the ability to downzone that to R3 today. They can do that already.
It's a 6 months process.
all right. Well, can somebody just explain what that is so that we're all on the same page? Because I think that that project did prompt this discussion and it hasn't really been addressed.
Sure, I'll explain the project. I don't have any slides today, but essentially, there's a big chunk of R4 property on Scoville owned by River Valley Church. They were originally going to put their church on the property before the recession. They had full plans to do a project. That didn't work out. They're not doing anything else. They've had it for sale since then, and nothing. Not a single interested party has looked at that, outside of somebody at one point was talking about the potential of putting a museum on the property. So then, this is back to, that's what R4 property allows. What we're looking to do as part of Chad's project is take the worst, we'll call it the worst 2 acres of that property, which is like a triangular shape in the corner, and put 22 cottages on that property that would all be divided into individual small lots through Middle Housing Land Division. And it would allow seniors that are, like I mentioned, this trapped in their homes, that are falling apart, they can't afford to do the deferred maintenance, to cash out their equity and get into, through his program, which is, a nonprofit, get into these small cottage units in a safe community, in a safe home that they can live in and actually own and have equity in. Like I mentioned, based on minimum density in the R4 zone, we have 22 units on the 2 acres. And I believe even with the exemptions that were just discussed, we still had to have 36 or 37. We have the parking lot with not quite 2 spaces per unit. And the challenge is the only way to get to those minimum density figures is to go up. And when you go up, you have to have more parking because you have, you're not double the units in this case, but close to that. So we've been talking about this for quite some time. This project is applicable for the ARPA funds. That whole we'll call it the northwest portion of Grants Pass in that area, that's part of the urban growth boundary expansion, has no utility infrastructure at all. No water, no sewer, no storm drain. This project would allow a public main to run through these properties as part of this process, sewer main, a water main to be extended over there, and essentially setting up that whole northwest corner of town for future development ability. Not taking it all out of the system. There's still additional acreage there that's R4. As Brian mentioned, yes, talking with staff, one of the options is we could go through a full zone change process and downzone it from R4 to R3. It does meet the minimum density for R3, just to put it in perspective. It's not a low density project. But as Chad mentioned, it's a 6+ month process to go through a rezone, and we have actually been waiting to have this meeting today just to at least get some feedback on it before we pursue that, because that's a very, very long process. I think that's the biggest problem with everything we do anymore is it's not so much directly a city thing, but it's just the permitting, the zoning, all that stuff with notifications and everything just takes so incredibly long. And it's another 6 months down the road, we don't have houses. And, and it's just kind of happening over and over again with all of our projects, even the small ones right now. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you. Valerie?
I just wanted to add to that, just having been married to a man who has built many projects and apartments all through the state. The cost, when you go to the 3rd floor, balloons. Because suddenly you have fire sprinkler systems you have to have in, you have to have the ability, the people who pay, he pays for water if there was a fire there every month. They have fees, I can't remember what it's called, but there's some way you have to actually are paying for the water that you're not using, because if you were to have a fire, you would need that much water. So the water requirements skyrocket. Unfortunately, damages that occur aren't usually from fires. They're from the water damage. So when there's a water and those sprinklers go off on the 3rd floor, you've just wiped out 3 floors because they can't turn them off until they have the permission from the fire department. So, I mean, it's just amazing. And you have to have an elevator if you have a third floor. So then you have an elevator. Well, now they have to have like a $5,000 every year inspection. And there's not just one person there, they've got to have two people there. So, I mean, costs go up and up and up once you get to that third floor. And so there you really are. That's where the cost comes from multifamily, is in those sorts of things.
Yeah, and ADA accessibility
Yes.
as well, which of course, ADA accessibility is not a bad thing, but when every single unit on the lower floor has to have ADA accessibility, you're talking different bathroom stuff, you know, counters, doorways, parking for ADA is also a thing, right? For every ADA space, you're losing a space next to it for the access aisle, so now your parking lot has to get bigger.
And everywhere you go, you have to have a certain angle because of, you know, wheelchairs and that sort of thing. So there's extreme costs that go
and that's
into
why
those
we're
projects.
finding right now, I believe that's the true intention of middle housing, the way it was set up from the state, is they factored in those things, which thankfully, you know, the state helps sometimes, and this is one of those things. And by doing townhomes, you eliminate those requirements. By doing duplexes, you could do 2 duplexes on the same lot now, and it's not a 4-plex, so it eliminates those requirements. We're still getting the density, but we're just doing it in a different way than the traditional multifamily apartment complex.
Okay, thank you. Vanessa, then Rob.
I did want to address the potential for the property to be rezoned. I understand that is an extensive process with ordinance changes through the city is also an extensive process that would likely have to go through the Urban Area Planning Commission, might have to go through the Housing Advisory Committee, might have to receive 2 readings from city council meetings. So it does seem like it would actually be easier for that project to conduct its own rezone to meet the minimum density standards for that property. I think that it was stated earlier by Amber that R3 and R4 zones should be treated like they're endangered species, and I really don't think that that can be stated enough. We only have so much land due to Oregon land use laws. We are prohibited from endless expansion. So once those R3 and R4 zones are gone, they are likely gone for good. That's with the state of laws that we currently practice now. We do know the more that you build out into the urban growth boundary, when we do start really getting out into those areas, development does become more expensive because, as stated, that infrastructure doesn't yet exist. So I don't think it's appropriate at this time to overhaul an ordinance for one project, but I would encourage the project developers to look at rezoning. It sounds like that might be the best option for you at this time. I did also want the council to move forward on exploring the incentivizing of development that the Housing Advisory Committee Chair brought up today. I think that there's some really good ideas there that are definitely worth exploring.
Rob.
So, Justin, on this, on Chad's project that we're talking about currently, that's what, 2 acres and 22 units is what we're talking about? So, other than ARPA funds, is there funding from the city that this project needs? Or any accommodations from the city? No, I'm asking what, in other words, what's restricting this project now?
Yeah, well, this is the biggest thing. I mean, so Chad's program, as we've mentioned, is affordable home ownership.
Right.
And this is a senior affordable home ownership. What we found is that we need to get the dirt for almost nothing, the infrastructure for almost nothing, at least a significant portion of it. And then that allows him to get the housing units and the development costs into that 120% window. One of the things that Chad mentioned just recently to me, and I'll just bring up on this point, is with interest rates going up, even though they get an interest rate buy down on current projects from Evergreen Federal, that 120% mark is the income level is growing to hit that mark. So, I'm probably saying that backwards, but so we need additional, any help with it, tax deferrals, obviously in that situation for these owners, even if it was for 3 years, lets them get into these houses easier, with knowing their payments are going to go up down the road a little bit. incentives for SDCs and permit costs, or, you know, if we can lower those, all it does is lower the cost of the sale and allows more people to get in there.
So is there infrastructure in the ground, or pipes in the ground now, or no?
No, this is bare land. Bare land, and there's no infrastructure along the roadways surrounding the land, so.
And it's church-owned now?
Church-owned now, correct.
So basically, the city's getting no property tax from it now at all?
That's correct.
So there's a perfect example of a project where if we gave a 2-year tax abatement, or it wouldn't cost the city anything as
Yes,
far as that
and
goes,
I
because
think
it's not making anything on it now.
Your point today is great on that, because you know, there's, of course, there's the possibility of a short-term implication not paying taxes, and it's only a possibility because it's only for things that actually would develop in that time frame. But then you have to look at the long term, 20, 40, 60 years out. All that income comes back and goes to public safety and goes to taxes and goes to infrastructure with the water bills that are associated with it.
Well, I really appreciate you bringing, or Chad bringing this project in front of us today, because I think when council originally wanted to supported the bi-monthly meetings with developers and such, this is exactly what we wanted. We didn't want to hear a year from now, oh, we missed an opportunity to put 22 units in. We wanted to know real time, what could we do? So I guess my question, you know, probably to staff would be, to staff and interested parties, is exactly what it would take to make this particular project, to get this particular project started in a short period of time. And I'm not saying that I'm all for it in every way, but it sounds very reasonable. It sounds like what we're looking for in so many levels. It checks a lot of boxes. So I really appreciate it bringing to the council's attention, because otherwise we wouldn't know about it. I guess that's pretty much all I have to say about that, but I would hope that maybe council can give direction today to staff to work with interested parties and find out, just for instance, what would be the fastest way to get that particular project happening. I don't know if we can, if the council wants to do all those things, but what would, in this particular case, I mean, one way is to go through an extensive rezoning and take however half a year or longer to do it, but are there other ways to do it? I'd like to give direction to staff today to come back to council to let us know what the fastest way to facilitate this happening. Beyond that, just a general comment, you know, we've heard from developers and we heard from Housing Advisory Committee about incentivizing. We've essentially, in one form or another, we've probably heard about, at least of the 6 possibilities, at least 5 of them had to do with incentivizing. I mean, the question that I always have every time we hear the word incentivize, the question is how much? I mean, it's just, sure, incentivizing sounds great. Well, who's got the money and where's it coming from, and how much would it take to tip the scales for a particular development? So that's, you know, there's a point at which, there's a point at which I would go out and build houses if the incentivize, if the incentives were big enough. But that's true for every project. So the question is really, incentivize is an easy word, but the question is how much, and where's the money coming from? But in this particular project, I'd like to know what council could do to make something like that happen. It sounds like it's something that we should be jumping on.
Looks like Aaron's going to take that.
So there really are 2 options for council that have already been discussed today, and that is, 1, the property owner can go through a rezone and go from an R3 to an R4 to an R3, and that would take about 4 months. Or council could remove the minimum density standards or make a modification to the current code, and that would take about 4 months. So you're looking at one of 2 options. Those are your 2 options to make that work. The minimum density is the issue at this point, and the zoning of the property is the issue at this point. So either the property owner initiating or the city initiating a change in the code.
Hang on, it's just a city council's meeting unless we want to continue with the Q&A with, I don't know, it's kind of uncharted territory. We keep muddling through when we have guests, but at this point, really, it's the council's meeting and we're not taking questions, but sorry.
Mayor, could I make one comment on that point, just as a suggestion?
All right.
Just because I'm standing here.
Just because you said.
One of the things that is currently underway right now that I mentioned was there's a code cycle, Article 12 code revision cycle, substantial one right now, that was focused heavily on middle housing. If we could potentially pull an exemption or further the exception process or something like that, even as a starting point, I'm just throwing it out there as a potential that we could piggyback onto that code cycle, which sounds like it's maybe a couple months out. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to ask, what is the possibility of modifying the minimum density to include an opportunity for an exemption rather than repeal? Because it sounds like we have a fairly divided council at this point, but an exception process might be a compromise.
Well, council would just need to provide direction on what those modifications would be, what standards would meet those modifications, and then we'd build that into the code for revision.
And that would take us approximately 4 months, you think, to get to that point, and then we'd have to consider any possible exemptions?
Correct. What Justin's referring to is the middle housing code, which has had a lot of discussion. It has had discussion at the Urban Area Planning Commission, but a formal amendment is still necessary, and that's what Aaron was referring to. That's it. I'm not sure where the 6 months figure comes from. We have never taken, to my knowledge, 6 months to do that, but certainly that 4 months is a better number. But it would still require that because we haven't had the public hearing at the Planning Commission yet. So any amendment, Mayor, to your point, whether that's changing the incentives only, changing the exceptions only, I'm sorry, that's still a code change.
Right.
So we don't have the ability to just go in and change the code without going through the hearing process.
Okay. Joel.
So it was my thought that on the minimum density, putting that in place without knowing where we're at in terms of our capacity and where we're at in terms of our target is probably premature. And we can always keep it on the tool shelf, but as we move forward, I think we need, and we got agreement, and I think our guests have made it clear, and we need to hear them and acknowledge them, that incentives will help. And so we need to move forward on those.
Yeah, it sounds like we have pretty strong support on the council for considering incentives, but what's on the table here today is minimum density standards. And so, council, I've heard 3 people, I guess, saying that they support keeping it, and 3 who would be willing to drop it, and a couple outliers I'm not sure about, and we haven't really discussed the idea of doing an exception instead of going with the on or off option. So, Dwayne.
I would like to at least see an exception policy placed in there. At the minimum, that would be my vote for it, be a minimum exception policy that can be brought to council and we can look at the project and say yes or no. And that's just where I'd sit. I don't think every R3 and R4 needs to be turned into housing, but I mean, we do need to have some kind of exception in there. And the process needs to be speeded up somehow.
Brian.
Yeah, I think it'd be great if we could turn all R3 and R4 into housing. That'd be awesome. I know that's not happening though. So I'm not opposed to looking at an exception process. I'm not sure exactly what that looks like or what roadblocks that's looking to overcome, but I'm hoping council has some ideas on that.
Vanessa.
In the event that we did move toward an exemption process for minimum density, I might suggest a tiered approach to reaching that minimum density amount. So if a project could not reach 60%, then in increments of 5, it would be considered. So if they were not able to meet 60%, we would look at 55. If 55 is unable to be met, we'd look at 50 and continue down the line with the burden of proof, of course, on the developer.
Rick?
As mentioned, a zone change would solve the situation on this one piece of property, and if it was brought forward, I think whatever process is going to be used is going to be about the same timeline, and it might be a more clear rather than cloudy type of, or confused project, if it just used the existing system for a zone change. Thank you.
Okay. Valerie?
Yeah, what I heard from both groups today was incentivize, 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 which, as you said, Sarah, I think is in agreement. But I think there's going to be a lot of exceptions that are coming through, because I think the reality of it is that we don't have those big pieces of property for the economic ability to make it economically feasible. So once again, I'll say it comes down to the smaller pieces of property and the middle housing, and I am really interested in seeing what's coming up in the middle housing code, and if that kind of addresses some of the things that we're talking about here, because it kind of, I don't know what it's going to be. Justin has a better handle on what it is. Whether that would make this easier or not, I don't know. So, I mean, we could make an exception process, but like I said, I just see that I think you're going to get a lot of exceptions, especially in our economy, if we really want housing to happen and happen now.
DJ?
Sure. Also on this list on slide 19, there's a few of them. So the lot exemption, 10,000 square foot lot exemption, I think we should consider that. Reducing the minimum density threshold. I think those are two. I think if we're forced into a compromise here other than repeal, then we need to consider those.
I'm going to jump in here, but one other thing too, and I think this was brought up several times, that I think this is really important, is the last thing you want to do is extinguish the creativity that is being brought to the table with this middle housing code, because I think that's what's going to do it, is our builders are being amazingly creative to try to make things work, and I hear it out there all the time. They're coming up with ideas that will work in our community, and I think it's really important that we give them credit for those creative responses. It's their income, it's their livelihood, it's their, you know, they know it far better than we do, and so I think it's really important that we give them that credit and give them that leeway. So once again, I will kind of stand up for incentivizing standards and not forcing them, because I think that we're better off with our local people getting us out of this than we are to depend on a large investors coming in to deal with it.
Okay, well, trying to find a way to move forward, I guess I had that Val, DJ, and Dwayne were interested in repealing the minimum density standards, and I don't know if I missed anybody there, but if we only have 3, then we're not going to move forward with that. Is there anybody else? Okay, so in that case, it looks like a repeal is off the table, and we can talk about exceptions and incentivizing higher density and encourage, I guess, the project that I think people are supportive of, you know, the cottage project in general, moving forward with a rezone. Sounds like that may be your quickest path forward, because the council, if they're willing to consider creating an exception in the minimum density standards, you're going to have to wait for the process of establishing the exception, and then you're going to have to apply to see if you actually get one. So I'll just say that up front. But we do need to figure out, how council wants to move forward on identifying any possible exemptions and incentivization for staff to bring back to us at another date. Rob?
So I'm not sure if I hope I'm understanding things correctly, but when Vanessa spoke about a tiered approach for hitting minimum densities, is that considered a repeal, or is that considered an exception? Because it's kind of part of both, right? Or either. So I'm just not sure, when you said repeal is off the table,
I mean, I guess to me, a
Is it
repeal
off the
would just
table
be
if it goes to- if it's-
removing it altogether, and that, yeah, creating some sort of tiered approach would be a reconsideration or an exemption of the minimum density code that we have on the books right now.
okay, well, I just didn't want you to misrepresent inadvertently, I assume, removing that is adjusting that, removing it, or is adjusting that, adjusting it?
Well, I
You
think
understand what I mean? Because I'm not necessarily
It would be an
against
amendment.
having a tiered approach, and so I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm locked into the 60% necessarily. That doesn't mean I'm interested in repealing it completely.
Well, I think what I think what we were really initially considering today is the possibility of repealing it entirely, which from what I'm hearing, there's only 3 counselors interested in that. 4?
Well, I counted 4, Sarah, so
Well, I listed the names. I had Valerie, DJ, and Dwayne.
and myself.
And you're interested in repealing it entirely?
Yes.
Okay, well, there's 4 then. So I guess I'm not prepared to break that tie at this moment. I think that we can create an exception that would allow certain projects to move forward without repealing the minimum density entirely, or given that our Housing Advisory Committee says that they have not considered reviewing the minimum density standards in light of the middle housing, maybe we could direct them to do that and consider minimum density changes at a future date. That's where I'm at. Valerie.
Okay, so I'm just trying to clarify what you just said. So you're saying that we could technically turn it back to the Housing Advisory Committee to have that discussion? Because that's kind of like what Tom said, they didn't really have that discussion. They had discussion about the incentivizing it, and they came up with some good things for the incentivizing it because they were all in favor of that, but they didn't really have that discussion as to whether to, so maybe that's what we should do, is turn it back to them to have that discussion and bring it forward.
Yeah, I think we could do that. My understanding is that there are middle housing changes that have taken place since the time that the council implemented the minimum density standards a year and a half ago. And so we could try to reconcile that and whether we need to repeal minimum density or make some changes in light of middle housing.
Yeah.
I'm just not going to make that decision today. So is that a correct explanation, those of you who are familiar with what the Housing Advisory Committee has been doing? Okay. So yeah, do you want to turn it back to the Housing Advisory Committee to come up with some specific suggestions? Joel?
So me, the alternatives are clear, and you can reduce the minimum density, you can eliminate it, you can keep it the same. And we come before the council, we have staff work prepared to look at those 3 options, and we make a decision. I think, I guess we could go back to the Housing Committee, but I feel they've thoroughly vetted the issue, and I'm not sure there's any more information that I would need beyond, are we, the potential to achieve our housing targets. So for example, if we're surpassing our targets, do we really need minimum density? If we're not surpassing our targets, by how much? And looking at what the future holds, do we need minimum density to achieve those targets? And it might be, that's one question. The second question is, are the incentives an even better way to do that than the regulation? So I just think we need a council decision.
DJ?
I agree. I think there's enough information on the table from everybody that could possibly provide this council information at this time.
So I guess in that case, what are you saying? Because if we put this to a council vote right now on minimum density, it sounds like y'all are going to deadlock and it's going to land on me. And that's what I'm telling you, is that I'm not prepared to repeal the minimum density standards at this time. So we can either direct Housing Advisory Committee to review the minimum density given middle housing, or we can direct some sort of exemption process or have Housing Advisory Committee or staff look into an exemption so that you can approve a single project without repealing the entire code, or, leave minimum density as it is and just look at incentives. Valerie?
Well, I am really curious about the middle housing thing coming back down through. When you said it was what, how long was that going to be?
Well, the
Code change.
Urban Area Planning Commission has already held one workshop. They asked for input from the development community. We solicited that last month. We have all of their input, so now we just are finalizing that, and we will be going for the formal amendment probably in a couple of weeks to put it out for public notice. So, but it's still, as Justin said, that still means the council still won't see that for about 3 months, because it has to go through the public notice and UAPC. So we're about 3 months.
Brian?
I'm sorry, I'm okay for now. Thank you.
Okay. All right, well, let's have our Housing Advisory Committee, well, I guess maybe we just need to wait for middle housing to go through before we reconsider.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's enough here that, at least from staff perspective, we can, integrate a lot of this into the middle housing amendment that's coming up. There is already a middle housing code, of course, and that's the state model that we're working under. But it doesn't, none of this answers the specific question on the cottage project. I think this is why, it came today, because we have had many discussions at staff level with the developer, and we have not been able to find an exception into the current code to help move them ahead. That's why we're at the deadlock we are. Other than the rezone is an option, and, we can work to move that as quickly and legally as possible through the system.
Yeah, well, personally, my recommendation would be to move forward on creating an allowance for council to consider an exemption, and we've highlighted one example here that I think is probably a worthy project that council would be, willing to entertain, but I'm not personally willing to overturn the entire code based on the specific needs of one project. So that's why I'm suggesting we need to come up with a different alternative. DJ?
Yeah, I need to clarify that I'm not having this discussion about one particular project. Now, as we have information on one project, I'm only seeing that as an example of a market and the implications of minimum density. I have no intention on repealing a code or creating an ordinance to make this for one project or one developer. I'm not having this conversation because one developer and one project asked us to have it. I'm looking at the evidence across the board from Housing Advisory Committee and home builders and taking the evidence and implications of the community on minimum density and our housing needs. So I want to declare that I'm not crossing that boundary or doing this for just one project. So I'm going to put that out there.
Fair enough.
Okay.
Valerie?
One other thing that I think we should pass off, because I've heard the support, is to look into the MUPT and what exactly is involved with that moving forward. So I think that is something that we're all I've kind of got to say, and I've always kind of hesitated because of public safety and my passion there, but you brought it to my attention that that's a long-term thing that would bring in more money in the long run, so it could be a positive. So I think it might be worth getting more information on that.
Okay, yeah, let's move forward with just having staff and or Housing Advisory Committee look at some incentives so that we can get more serious about incentivizing increased density. I think there's strong support for that, and we've heard some good ideas already from Housing Advisory Committee, so I'm not sure where in the process, if that needs to go back to them or if staff just wants to put together a list. We heard good ideas from home builders too.
Yeah, I recommend we just go ahead and schedule a future workshop. Staff can provide presentation with the Housing Advisory Committee Chair present to discuss the 3 main incentives that they provided this afternoon.
Okay. Yeah.
So does that mean that at this time that we're not going to discuss adding any additional exceptions or any kind of scoring system for exceptions or anything like that? Does that mean we're not considering that any further?
If council wants to create an exception process, speak up, because I only heard two people.
I certainly would like to see, I mean, there's a risk, to me the biggest, and maybe it's all that I see, but to me the biggest risk of an exception process is that whether it's this council or future councils, we end up potentially playing favorites. And, you know, you want to try to be as level playing field consistently as possible. But I personally would like to see an exception process beyond the books. I'd like to see, I guess, a somewhat objective scoring system for exceptions to be considered. I think that regardless of what we come up with, since we are in such a, I believe, a dire housing crisis, I think an exception process would be really helpful in the coming years so that we can essentially maximize situations that may fall through the cracks. We can maximize our housing potential, because I think exceptions could be helpful there. But that's one counselor. I'd like to hear from a few more.
Okay, Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with Rob. I think that looking at that is a good idea, as long as it can be structured in a fair and objective way. I like Vanessa's suggestion of a tiered approach where they're still meeting the maximum density they possibly can. So if that's a part of the exception process, I would probably be in favor of that. Thank you.
Okay, so I have Dwayne, Rob, and Brian willing to consider an exception process, and Rick said that he would rather just stick with the current rezone process. Anybody else? Okay. So let's also talk about exceptions going forward. But obviously, I don't know if anybody wants to elaborate on that today or just save it for another day. So unfortunately for the builders, this is where things get slow, right? All right, I think we'll save that one for another day, and we need to move on to the second item on our agenda, unless anybody has any objections. Looks like you're scooting out, Joel.
I have a previous appointment that I need to honor, so keep on and have good, open, honest discussions.
All right, thanks. The next item on our agenda is to talk about city-initiated UGB rezone. I guess we've had an unofficial, break here, but go ahead, Brad, and get us back on track.
Okay. So I will move through your next agenda item here. So this is a subject to update council on the prioritization of a second city-initiated rezone, and then we have two council goals particularly that this relates to: facilitate sustainable, manageable growth and provide cooperative shared leadership involving council staff and community. May 15th is when you had a last workshop on this topic. We presented the 5 UGB areas that will retain the rural zoning and still need city zoning. At that meeting, council voiced support to continue the city-initiated rezones and us funding the transportation impact analyses as a tool. There was also several comments from the council. The mayor did not ask for any particular vote on this, but there were several comments that said basically, yes, we want to see this move ahead, and we also want some other citizen input. There were a few of you did say that the southeast and the southwest seem to be particularly attractive as far as the next area to rezone. So we did put this before the Housing Advisory Committee and Collaborative Economic Development Committee, this question about, well, which sub-area do you think the city should pursue next? Both of them did say that Southwest, what's being called Southwest AB, that's just a carryover name from when we started this process a couple of years ago. That would be their top priority. So that is what we have been looking at. Here are those 5 sub-areas again that you've seen several times. And again, the one that is being moved forward and recommended to be moved forward, I should say, is Southwest AB. It's this all on the south side of Redwood Highway, Highway 199. So this is just a closer look at that. Not including this area on the north side of 199, it's about 100 tax lots. It's about 315 acres. And that does include the RCC campus. It also includes everything north of Desmarais and Wolf Lane. It does not include any of the urban reserve. So we have an urban reserve that's designated east of Desmarais and south of Wolf Lane. That does add a lot of property, and you were talking about at your last agenda item how important, increasing our buildable land supply is. We've heard that for several years now. This is probably one of our least parcelized urban reserve areas right here, but we are not showing it because at this point in time we're not able to move that ahead as a rezone because it's not in the urban growth boundary. This is just to give you the aerials, just to show you, we are talking about a relatively undeveloped part of the urban growth boundary. There are some rural residences out here. Here's the area kind of looking from Hubbard to the east. And again, most of the parcels do have some residential development, but a lot of undeveloped area to expand into. The main justification is of why we would proceed with this area. There's several here on the screen. It is the largest in terms of size and areas and undeveloped tracts. It has the highest potential to develop as far as total number of units, mainly because the comprehensive plan designation here is medium to high. More so than in the other sub-areas, which is medium and low. Another big reason is that the engineering is actually complete for the water main extension. I'll just go back to that. So there is no existing public water that is available. There's some of it stubbed, but it's going to really need a full over, I believe it's about 1.5 miles to 2 miles of new water main. That project has actually been designed and Public Works has those drawings. They also have some funding for it, but not all of it. So that's another reason to move this ahead. It does also allow for more mixed zoning. So from the CED standpoint, they liked that it wasn't 100% residential. This sub-area has both commercial, office, and residential. And then the last point, the city did get a DLCD Transportation and Growth Management Grant back in 2013. That was done by Crandall and Rambula. A pretty intensive analysis was done at that time, and several conceptual ideas for how to rezone. And these concepts here on this slide show some of the product that came out of that study. It's over 100 pages long. There's a lot to it, and I think the fact that it kind of focused on this part of Redwood is just another benefit to moving this area ahead, because there is quite a bit of research there. As with all of these areas, there's challenges. These are a few of them. There's significant frontage on Highway 199 here. None of the other sub areas have near as much frontage, and so that just brings up the whole question about approach, access, spacing, ODOT policy. They're going to be much more involved in this sub area than the others. There is no current funding source for a future east-west sewer trunk. There is significant money for the water, but not for the sewer. There's also the challenge of estimating non-residential trips. Because of the amount of acreage that is not residential, it's really difficult to say, okay, you know, this parcel is going to generate this many trips when we don't know what the use is. So that's when you pre-zone something without having a development application, that does present a challenge. And again, this isn't to say that we shouldn't pursue it, it's just I'm trying to be upfront with you. Funding for potential traffic mitigation. Again, this really ties back to the first bullet. In order for the city to do city-initiated rezones, we have to go through that state process, which is why we have gotten so far behind the ball on the Allen Creek one. On the Allen Creek, you know, there's not likely, and we're still waiting for that final ODOT letter, but not likely to be any new significant traffic mitigation other than maybe a couple of turn lanes that are widening turn lanes. That's probably not the case here. There will probably be some other traffic mitigation. That doesn't mean we have to fund them, but it does mean we have to identify them and identify potential funding. And then questions, concerns regarding future annexation, that would be the case for any of these. You know, we have had a survey in Allen Creek where we put out to the Allen Creek property owners that they're well aware that the city is proceeding ahead with this rezone process and annexation, but we have not had that level of outreach with this sub area. But again, that would be with any of the others as well. So in terms of moving this thing ahead, October, November would be ongoing discussions with ODOT, DLCD, and DEA, our consultant, about finalizing the TIA cost estimates. We've gotten some preliminary numbers, but you know, we would want to get a hard number from them so we know exactly what that cost is. The December, we would bring back to you in another workshop the specific cost for rezoning this area, and then if you decide to proceed, then there's a tentative outline there and a schedule for what we'd be looking at. The annexation piece is, I think, one that staff would appreciate hearing from council today. We have not, to my knowledge, had any significant annexations, you know, to this level. This is over 300 acres. So while we have the ability to rezone land without annexing it, I've had several conversations with Aaron about the pros and cons of that. So we have been trying to move us to the point where we're no longer using service and annexation agreements and putting land under city zoning without it being annexed. So we're making the assumption here that the council continues to be in support of that. Just to be clear, though, it's possible that we can do it without annexation, but we do think that there's a lot of negatives to that and are trying to move us away from those extension of services, without annexation. So that is something that would be helpful for us to hear if you have feedback today on that. So the call to action is there. In terms of cost implication, Public Works, I talked to Jason last week. They are, still looking how to identify the gap funding for that water main. That piece is probably more critical than the sewer. I mean, the sewer can be put in by private development as it happens. It's just if somebody chooses to develop kind of in the middle of that 300 acres, that's going to be a challenge to get sewer. So there's some, but the water piece is quite important. And then the TIA cost, as I mentioned, is specifically unknown, expected to exceed $75,000. And again, that's really because of all of the non-residential acreage that is in this area. So additional discussions are planned at HAC, CEDC, and the Urban Planning Commission regarding the other UGB rezone areas. In May, Council indicated support to proceed on those. We wanted to talk about maybe a schedule, and that would be the reason for that. And but this is where we've put our time and energy to date. So that's what I have for you.
Thanks, Brad. Questions? Rick?
Thank you, Brad. Just for clarification, we have, various items here. One is the rezone. So even without water, even without city sewer out there, we're able to rezone it to a city designation?
Well, the rezone would ideally be timed with the water main extension.
Okay, so we have partial funding for water, so we'd have to come up with additional funding. But on the sewer, the sewer can come after the fact?
Yeah, there is sewer trunk lines that are stubbed across 199 from the north to the south side. And in fact, we do have, for example, the co-op that is on the south side and over on Hubbard, so there are stubs that serve that area. It's the east-west that there is no existing sewer trunk. So if we didn't already have the stubs south of 199, I would say that we would have a lot more hesitation about moving this particular area forward, but there are 4 stubs already there.
So I'm just confused on the process. I know we need to move forward. We need to create additional land. I'm all for that. So just in the processing, annexation, if annexation were to occur, then there would have to be total commitment in funding for both sewer and water, correct?
I don't think that that's entirely correct. I mean, we have annexed property before where there wasn't service directly at the property. But again, we're still doing some due diligence on this recommendation at the staff level. So we will continue to research that piece.
And then on our preference level, when we rezone to city zoning, again, procedurally, do we want those facilities in place before it's rezoned, or just as long as the commitment is there?
Well, I think it's a similar answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions? All right, no questions.
Thanks.
Who wants to kick off discussion? DJ, go for it.
Sure. I think it's vetted by CDC and Housing Advisory, and I think we should rock and roll with identifying the Southwest AB as the next area for rezoning and follow per staff's recommendations.
Valerie?
Yeah, I'm going to agree as well, because of the input that we have there. I also want to say in talking with ODOT, they are right now re-looking at that whole area and kind of opening it wide open again and looking at it from day one. So this might be the time to go along with that as well. So I think that's all the more reason to kick it off and let it happen.
Dwayne?
I agree, we need to keep moving forward. That's our goal.
Okay. Brian left when we switched topics, but he told me he does support this. So it sounds like we have at least 4 in support of moving forward. Anybody else? Rick says yes. Rob? Okay. What's the next step here that we need to do is to do the council workshop like December? Is that?
Yes, I mean, we could avoid the workshop and just bring it to you. I mean, as a business meeting item, and you could deliberate it there. I mean, that would save also a little bit of time in terms of the cost. But again, we're likely to have to put the budget for the TIA into the FY25 budget. So whether we have the motion, the formal motion and resolution in a business meeting in December or in a workshop, I mean, unless we can identify some other funding, depending on what the TIA cost comes back. I mean, if it is that 75 to 100, we will obviously look at our budget and see if we can find some of the funds there. But I'm at this point, I am not expecting that to be the case. So my recommendation was to still, do it as a workshop so that we can bring the full scope of work and the full details of the budget to you.
Yeah, I would love to say we could skip a step, but it seems like that backfires more often than not when we try it. So let's go ahead and move forward with that as planned. And sounds like, does anybody have any questions or issues they want to make sure are addressed? Not at this time. All right. Do you need anything else from us? Nope. Okay, we'll move on to agenda review. We have a meeting on Wednesday this week with a public hearing for the stormwater development standards. Council action items include amending the second reading on the transient lodging tax, a ordinance to revise Title 2.23 procurement. That's a little, see if I have a better explanation for that here.
I think it's
Declaring
basically
an emergency.
Yeah, it's emergency. So
Okay.
what happened and why we had the special meeting is because there was no anything in there for an emergency.
Right. I just didn't like saying the numbers. I know our viewers at home would like to know a few words. A resolution to give a community wildfire defense grant, probably to receive it rather than to give it.
Don't we have to give permission to go off for the grant? Is that what it is?
Is that what we're doing, applying for it? I don't know. Aaron's left the room.
Yeah,
Yes,
well, I think
Brad
it
is
means
saying
we're
yes,
just-
applying for a grant.
It's applying.
A motion that would approve the findings of fact for zone map amendment, a motion that would approve the findings of fact for the Long Ridge, Washington Historic Design Overlay District, and appointing 1 member to the Committee on Public Art and 3 members to the Tree Advisory Committee. And then during matters from mayor and council, we're going to discuss that Measure 110 letter that a draft of it was sent out last week. So if you have not already read that and provided feedback, be sure you do before Wednesday so that hopefully we can move forward on that. And then we have no meetings. Next week is the League of Oregon City Conference. And then we'll be back on October 16th. And I have already written down to do another workshop having to do with incentives for high-density housing, as well as a possible exception process for minimum density standards. Is there anything else anybody wanted to get on there? DJ?
Sure. I have your letter from Home Builders Association. Did everybody get a copy of that letter on the dais today?
Yeah.
Okay. They have identified 5 priorities One good thing is one of those priorities, multifamily permits and SDC reductions. I think we can slough that into the conversation as a whole for minimum density that we're just talking about today. But those other 4 are going to take explicit council directive to staff to either work on or present. It's my understanding that staff really can't do anything about those prioritized items unless like I said, council gives explicit direction to do so. I wouldn't necessarily say that those other 4 items are in order of priority, but in talking with that association, these are 4 items that need addressed, and it is up to council to direct at this point.
Okay, so these are the bullets on the second page?
Yeah, the bullets on the second page, HBA priority list. There's 5 of them, but what I keep saying 4, but like I just said, if you were listening, that one of these items can be put into the discussion that we're going to be having about minimum density, so we can see these as being 4 items to prioritize, all of which need explicit council direction to start working on. That being said, most of them are very complicated. Planter strips, not so much. The other ones are very complicated issues that have been determined by the building community to be of paramount importance of their priority list. So I'd like to see these get on the agenda. I don't think it's necessarily prudent to put them on the agenda every 2 months for home builders to come in and talk about. It's my opinion that we are at the point that we need to start having these discussions in earnest and directing staff about what we'd like to do with them.
Can you explain exactly, and I just say this because I know that we have the stormwater thing coming up on Wednesday night's meeting, what exactly double erosion control permit?
So you'll get a brief synopsis of that. That's item 21 on there.
Okay.
You know, they get very superficial synopsis of what's going on there. If you want more information, like I said, we're at the point where we need explicit direction to staff to give more information as to why we need to talk about them. And all these are policy-driven decisions, and staff's kind of at a lockstep right now. No, that's not the right word. Staff's at kind of a holding pattern. There we go.
No, you're right. The items there primarily would be best if we had a workshop on each one of those items, started scheduling those, because they are deep in policy discussion to give direction to make things happen. So.
Okay, so you actually think each one of them is a separate workshop potentially?
Yeah, except for the one that Councilor Facer said that could maybe be rolled into some of what we're already working on. The other ones, I think, would require some policy direction, and with being provided council some additional information so we can have informed discussion on where you'd like to go with that policy.
I can provide more input if you'd like about maybe prioritization or how to maybe handle those.
Well, sure. Is there one that you recommend going first anyway?
Double erosion control permit, that's linked to the MS4 designation that we're getting soon. And so that's time sensitive because that's coming and happening anyway. So I'd identify that probably as the #1 priority. Private streets and water and sewer easements, I think, are similar enough to perhaps tackle in one workshop. Now, technical expertise is over on that corner, and planter strips is sort of, I could easily identify as the lower priority among them, but still identified as a priority of the home builders.
Right. Okay, thank you. Anything else going forward? Vanessa?
I wanted us to hopefully have a discussion on expanding additional park buffers for resting in relation to their proximity to parks. I don't have a recommended foot buffer, but I would like us to have that discussion.
DJ's saying yes?
Yeah, explain it one more time. You're asking for park buffers for?
Park buffers for resting in relation to their proximity to schools.
Okay.
So creating buffers around schools.
Okay, I do know that that's being brought up at school board meeting.
So we've been having conversations with both Three Rivers School District and District 7. We had made an agreement with District 7 as it related to Gilbert Creek Park to extend the buffers already. And so we extended the buffers from 20 feet from walkways that lead to district property to 50 feet. We also ended up doing the same thing at Fruitdale Park. So, and we met with the superintendent last Thursday for Three Rivers. They essentially wanted us to close the park, which is something we can't do at this point in time. But we have extended the buffers at the parks that do abut district property, with the exception of Eckstein Park, because the issue, as I understand it, at Eckstein Park is more car camping than actual tents in the ground. So I have been in contact with both superintendents and have explained kind of our situation, and we've tried to remedy that through some of the changes in the park rules over the last month.
Can we receive a memo on what that looks like on a map, those extended buffers?
I'll send you what the buffers look like. We did get that mocked up.
Thank you.
I also want to say, because when I was at the last meeting, I do know that Gilbert Creek was also one they were worried about parking. Did you talk about that with Gilbert Creek?
We did, and the issue with parking is that we're enjoined from enforcing the parking rules that we have, our parking ordinances. In addition, another thing that came up was individuals who were kind of just milling around in the morning, they're just sitting at benches or milling about. And that's really difficult because the police are not going to be enforcing people who are utilizing the park space if they're not breaking any rules or breaking any laws. So it's one of those really touchy things that, police have to be mindful of when they're out enforcing. But those conversations were had, and the discussion that that District 7 had about potentially terminating the leases, that was had without any sort of heads up to us. So that was kind of a blindsided thing. But we have spoken with their general counsel, and we're kind of waiting on Mr. Ransom before we move forward.
It is on their agenda on Wednesday night. Same time we have a meeting. They do have an executive session dealing with the parks. So it is currently, as a result of the discussion they had on. So I think we just need to be kept in the loop.
Okay. As Councilor Auger asked for, I will send the buffers. If you'd like, I can send you also a memo, a brief recap of the discussions that I've had with both superintendents, if that would help. Okay, you can expect that probably by the end of this week.
Anything further? All right. Valerie?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Seconded by Rick. All in favor of adjourning, say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, we're adjourned. See you Wednesday night.